What an incredible film. And like the amazing Don Hudson, I saw the film when it first came out in 1999. For me, it was in Philadelphia, not LA. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that it changed my life. I had just returned from Vietnam doing archival research and working on my dissertation. And I was having a really hard time and figuring, what am I going to do? This grad school thing might not work out. And after seeing this film, I said I wanted to produce something as incredible to give back to the land of my birth and to my adopted home country. So it inspired me to stay with graduate school to get that PhD and to write the dissertation. So for me, I'm fangirling my good friend Tony Boy a bit, for a historian to be able to talk to her idol of a filmmaker director. So it's a real treat for me to be on stage with you tonight. So back in 1999, when it first came out, it won the top 3 prizes at Sundance, a film festival. Where it screened, it won Best Audience Picture, Best Cinematography, and the Grand Jury Prize. Fast forward 25 years later, at the 40th anniversary of Sundance Film Festival, and it was chosen as one of the 10 landmark films. In that year that you were able to restore and remaster the film with a little bit of our help, it came out and just was so well received on the film festival circuit here in New York City, pretty much everywhere, globally, wherever it screened. And on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War and the 30th anniversary of U.S. Vietnam Reconciliation, I want to ask you just this very basic question. Why was it so well received back in 1999? Why is it so well received today when it has magically been restored and we can see it again? What resonates with people, in your opinion? I have my views and opinions, but I want to hear from you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the introduction, Professor Hung, and thank you guys for sticking around for it, even with the little slight mishap in the beginning. I will tell you this, we did a screening in Havana, of all places, and a screening on celluloid, which was actually, it was an incredible screening. And midway through the screening, the film snapped, and it just started going like that. So this happens when you project films and show films, even though it's digital. So in this case, the film didn't snap, but the subtitles magically disappeared. So I'm not sure what happened. Okay, but yeah, it's we're on the occasion of the 50th and the 30th. So screening the film here is really meaningful. We've had an amazing 3-day conference at Columbia, so so it's really meaningful to be able to show this film to in a way, end the conference in many ways. In terms of relevance, it's hard, because as an artist, we make films. We don't think about how it's going to be relevant, honestly, 25 years later. And it's actually mind-blowing to think that it's been 25 years. You are driven by certain impulses, and some of that I said in the beginning in my opening speech about, when you take on a piece of art and why you want to do things. And you can't even think 25 years later because those impulses can even be different within the making of the film, right? So especially when you make a film, it takes so long. When you start something, 6 months later, those impulses can change. And by the time in the editing room, especially if you're the writer like I was on this, you're actually editing a film in which your emotions and your involvement with it changes from you when you originally wrote it. So in many ways, the writing process is actually the writing the first time. You write it again when you're directing. You write it again when you're editing. Actually, Tarantino said that very famously. And it's very true. So, so the best you can do is hold on to whatever those impulses are and what drives you and stay true to them and try to have as much clarity as possible. And for me, it was just what I said in the beginning. And I think the themes that, in terms of, not about whether the film's successful, but whether the film is relevant to me is because it dealt with themes that were important for Vietnam, but weren't told. And the thing for me about this film is, there was a lot of films about the Vietnam, and there was always through the lens of war. And in those films, the depiction of Vietnam was always through the lens of both either through loss or victory. And all the conversations in the films are always through those points of view. And for this, I wanted to make a film about the people who were actually in the spaces in between that, in which it was about the everyday struggles and the quiet strength, and the people who had their own victories and their own losses, but in different ways. And sometimes they only, affect themselves or the family members or their community, but it's still relevant and important. And then for me, it was about trying to figure out how to speak about all that in a way that was universal. Because the heroes that we see day in and day out of our lives aren't on the battlefield, right? They're not these all epic, grand, moments in lives. But it's about the quiet moments that I try to depict in this film. It's about the small choices that collect together that affect, your individual lives. And so because of that, I think there's something very universal about those actions. And I think that's why it's relevant, especially in a film which I purposely avoided trying to make a direct war film. But it's a film that still dealt with, it's a film that's still tethered to the war, but it dealt with the transformation of a country and transformation of a people post-war. And the reason why I think it's still relevant today and still had, once we were able to renew it and get it restored and has this amazing cycle of the past year and a half is because those themes are still relevant for Vietnam. Still a country, still a country going through transformation. It's still a country trying to find its identity. It's still a country, filled with people trying to find their place. So I think it still speaks to what's going on today.
That was my second question, which is just, again, for me, what was amazing about it was watching it, in this past year, that it does seem like, as we've called it, a time capsule. I remember Vietnam of the late 1990s, and the film just evoked the smells, the sounds. I mean, can't smell, but I could remember Vietnam back in the day, and it just perfectly captured Vietnam in this transition period that you're talking about. And I wanted to ask, do you think it's still relevant today? Vietnam is in a very different place than it was in 1999. I mean, 2025, it is on the cusp of going, to become from a transition from a middle-income country to a high-income country. But you do feel that those stories would still exist today, that you would go, you maybe try to find a cyclo driver, maybe not in Ho Chi Minh City, but say in Hue, and have the same conversations.
Not only do I think it's relevant for Vietnam today, but I think it's relevant for most countries that have gone through war and gone through a lot of conflict, which is unfortunately still happening today. So, a film about, it's like I said earlier, it's what I try to focus on with this was the aftermath. The people who had to pick up the pieces and dealt with sort of the choices thrust upon them by people who are much richer, more powerful, and much more influential than them. But those choices ripple down to them, and then it still affects their lives. So it's about people who are trying to make sense of all that with dignity and with with as much human connection as possible. And that's one of the themes that's really important for me here. It was this idea of human connection. And that's universal. So the way I approached this in the writing of it, was try to deal with those themes that was relevant to Vietnam, but created in a way in which, I always said when I wrote this, I want it to be so that a student in Kansas, a school teacher in Germany, someone in Africa can be watching this, and they can still be moved by it, because it deals with themes and peoples and character arcs and that can still speak to them, because these are universal truths. And that's what's important to me in dealing with this. We all know what it feels like to hold on to tradition. We all know what it feels like to think that there's something better for us on that other side of that door. In this case, the cyclo driver thinking the hotel represented something better for them, and chasing that, right? We all know what it feels like to have something taken away from us and wanting it back. We all know what it feels like to believe that our words and our music and our poetry mean something, right? And so that that's played out in the storytelling of the lotus picker and the leper. So these themes, because they're universal, will always be relevant in my opinion, and that's why I try to lean into when I made this film.
I want to save a lot of time for audience questions, particularly because a lot of our students are here in attendance, and we've had this great semester in which we've offered a course, Vietnam War, a special 50th anniversary edition. So I want to let them have time to ask their questions, and I just want to flag that there is a folks with the microphone. So just prepare your questions as I ask this final one of Tony Boy. And it follows from something that we've been talking about the past few days at our conference, but also something you said earlier, which is that you didn't set out to make a Vietnam War film. Most films, as we know, made about Vietnam seen through the lens of war. And so you don't consider this a war film. But we had a really vibrant conversation about what really, sort of makes up a war film. What films did you choose, and say something like the Criterion Collection that made it into that elite list. So asking this question of you in particular, as a Vietnamese American, this is a twist of a question I haven't asked you before. None of the characters are Vietnamese, say, from the losing side, the Republic of Vietnam. I'm just making that guess. You didn't make it a sort of obvious composite character. None of those sort of moving around were of the losing side, let's say, and that is where you come from as a diasporic Vietnamese. Was that a conscious choice? What aspects of the war were you grappling with? What sort of issues were you trying to avoid?
I don't think I was trying to avoid anything because, other works I've done dealt with the losing side, as you say, or the diaspora, right? So, I produced and written films about the refugee experience, and my first short film was actually about a community of Vietnamese and the struggles of that when, in the 90s. And again, it's just about what your impulses are at that time, what's driving you. And I was spending a lot of time in Vietnam in the late 90s, so I was a lot of what's on this film I was experiencing. These are the people that I was spending a lot of time with. And these are the voices that were affecting me and I was emotionally connected to and I wanted to put on the screen. And so it was really that. I wasn't trying to avoid anything, but maybe I was being pulled to something instead of being avoiding.
Interesting, because Harvey was the only character. He was the returning Vietnam vet, but the two other vignettes or stories had nothing to do with the war.
Yeah, so in terms of, I think there was definitely a conscious effort to not make a war film in the way that one would think that one would automatically think about when I think of a war film, right? There's no battlefield sequences, there's no, like I said earlier, And it's a reaction off of watching so many of these when I was young. I had, one of the main criteria I had was that I didn't want anyone holding a gun, running through the jungles. I don't want anyone shooting at anyone, But, I think the definition of a war film being only those kinds of film is limited. Because in many ways, this is a different kind of war film. It's a film about the aftermath. It's about the trauma. It's about it's about the ripple effect. Or as I said in Friday, it's about the echoes of war. And those echoes, go far and are impactful. And these characters are dealing with those echoes but that's something that's not often seen in movies. And I get it. Movies are expensive. You want the shock and awe of battlefields. You want all that. You want to bring people into the theaters. So that kind of courage and bravery that's really apparent is something that makes for easier casting and easier filmmaking because films are expensive and you want to get it made. You have to and sometimes films are defined really by in those big grand sort of paintbrushes of it's like we got winners over here, losers over here, and they're clearly the winning side, losing side, the weak and the strong and stuff like that. This film, I wanted to make sure avoided all that, and hopefully, in between all those spaces, a different kind of strength, a different kind of heroism starts to rise to the top, and so that's what I was trying to do with this. And so it's not that it's completely I was trying to avoid war. I was just trying to make a different kind of film that would speak about the war in a different way. And look, and Harvey Keitel's character is very much, tethers us to the war as well, right? And that's one of the things I think still makes this film relevant is because that connection that Harvey gives us is something that will always be there. Even after 50th anniversary, we still have a lot of veterans coming back to Vietnam and speaking about it, and rightfully so, and that's an important conversation to continue to have. But I wanted to make space for other conversations as well.
I know I promised us to kind of open this up to the audience, I just have one final question, and I do want to point out one Vietnam vet in the audience that deserves a special shout out, and that's Tommy Vallely. So Tommy, can you just wave here? There he is. But I just want to show you can ask these sorts of questions to Tony. So Norman, Spencer, right here too. Thank you, Norman. A question about, because the Sympathizer just came out, and a purposeful, only one character of that entire series was not Vietnamese, Caucasian, played by Robert Downey Jr. You started that. I want to kind of contribute to this because there's only Harvey Keitel, but just share that story about Harvey. Was that, was he always destined to play that Vietnam vet? What was he, what was his, tell the story that you have about Harvey Keitel, and now I'm going to have students now just prepare, because I will shut up after this, but just to show a moment of levity.
All right. So yeah, look, I think telling a story, especially that time, the late 90s, about Vietnam, and if I were to be honest with the experiences about meeting a lot of different people and telling these different stories, I was also obviously meeting a lot of veterans who were coming back at the time. So I just felt like a no-brainer to tell that story. It felt natural. And so I wrote it, and I think I know the story you're talking about. So I originally, look, Harvey Keitel is an icon of independent cinema. He's a god of independent cinema, but a god of just an icon of film in general, especially in the 90s. He started the career in the 70s for Martin Scorsese. He started the career of Quentin Tarantino with, Reservoir Dogs, Abel Ferrara, Bad Lieutenant. On and on and on. And basically at that time, if you got Harvey Keitel to be in your film, you were guaranteed to make your film. And I remember even having like his pictures on my wall when I was in film school. So he's, so, I wrote the character of James Hager, the character in there, and I sent him the script. And it was just an amazing moment where he, he sent a message back through the agent to the studio that he really liked the screenplay and he wanted to meet me. So it was an incredible feeling. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Harvey Keitel wants to be in the film. This is amazing. They flew me out to New York City. I went to Tribeca, met him at his company called the Goat Singers. And I remember sitting down across from Harvey Keitel. I was young. I was just right out of film school. This was such an amazing moment. Harvey Keitel wants to be in my film. And then Harvey goes, Tony, I love your screenplay. I want to be in the film, but I want to play Teacher Dao, the leper poet. And all that adrenaline, joy, everything was like just sunk. And I just couldn't believe that one of my heroes wanted to play a Vietnamese man on the screen. And he actually said to me, he was like, don't worry, Tony, I understand, but we're doing amazing things with prosthetics these days. And the leprosy would cover my face, and I can do this. And I didn't even know how to say no to him because I was so scared. And then I eventually said, Harvey, I don't know if you know this, but all the Vietnamese characters are actually going to speak Vietnamese. And then I remember he looked at my face, there was a pause, like he was thinking he can actually learn Vietnamese. And then he paused and he said, all right, okay, then I can't do it. But he never said he wanted to play the character of the American, which I didn't think I had to identify which character. I just sent him the script, And it took another 2 weeks. It was aggravating. So they kept me in New York. I never left. And it was basically, he wanted to think about it. I had another meeting with him. We had to change a couple of things around. And then he eventually said yes. But it was definitely a scary moment for many reasons. But I do want to say this about him, because I just don't want to make it seem like he was just trying to do yellow face and stuff like that. He actually, he's a method actor. I'm not saying it's excusable, but I think he just loved the writing, the poetry, and the storytelling so much. And he had just gone off doing the piano with Jane Campion and all that. But when we finished the film, he asked us to find an orphanage, and we did. And he ended up donating his entire fee and salary to a Vietnamese orphanage. So it's just really beautiful. So I always say Harvey lost money making our film,
Again, the range of questions you can ask Mr. Tony Bui, so I'll open it up to the audience. So, Callisto?
Oh, okay. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I'm Callisto. I'm an undergrad. I took the Vietnam War class, and I was in Tony Bui's Vietnam War and cinema class for a while. I wanted to or I have two questions and one thing I wanted to say. Watching the movie, I want you to know it is so apparent that you were shooting to capture the everyday strength of people. Because I was watching the film and the whole time I was thinking, this character is so strong and they're resilient. And then the next vignette would happen and I was like, okay, this one's also strong. And I think that was like a wonder, like you achieved that. I think it spoke to that.
Thank you.
So for the poetry, did you write the poetry or is it poetry that how did you get the poetry for the poet's part?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the character of Teacher Dao is actually based on a real-life poet named Hamak Dao, who did contract leprosy and is a significant part of Vietnamese literary history. But I grew up. My mom was was a poet, so I grew up around that energy, that spirit. And I might have said this in a talk a couple days ago, but my parents rarely ever talked about the war. Like, it just wasn't, something they did. They were refugees. They just wanted to make sure that we grew up in sort of this new space, America. They didn't want the past to sort of, hold us, to anchor us in any way. But my mom, because of her, because her love for poetry and her writings, she gave that to us. And so that was always in sort of the spirit of our home. So when I was writing this, even though I can speak Vietnamese, I can't actually write in Vietnamese. So I actually wrote everything, and I wrote the poetry, so I did the first pass, I wrote the poetry. Then I gave the script to my mom to translate. So the Vietnamese version that the actors would use and that actually went to the Ministry of Culture to get it approved was actually through my mom's translations. When she translated it, she did such an amazing job that the poetry actually, was improved, when she, translated to Vietnamese. She gave it just a breath and a soul that was something that I could not actually do in English. So it was actually beautiful. And then eventually that draft had to go back to me because most of my crew, I brought a lot of crew from different parts of the world, but we needed a common language for our crew. So we needed an English script. So it was eventually translated back to English. And then I would make changes depending on, different things that happen. You always constantly worked on the script up until shooting. So that went back and forth between my mom and myself for about 7, 8 drafts like that. So the final outcome of all aspects of the film, but the most impact is the poetry, was through this back and forth between my mom and myself through the translation. And it just became something that, so every part of her is embedded within those words as well.
To say this was a family affair because this is also your brother, this co-producer, and then Dan Zeung is a famous actor in his own right, but also happened to be related to Tony as his uncle on his mom's side.
He plays the sickle driver. Yeah, he's my mom's younger brother.
He's like the Robert Redford or Paul Newman of Vietnam. He's passed now, but he was already a famous actor before starring in 3 seasons.
But a quick story of that, it's not why I became a filmmaker. My mom was absolutely against me being a filmmaker. And she was like, there's no way in the world, we just, we came to America, sacrificed everything so that you can go and study the arts. My mom was devastated when I said I wanted to be a filmmaker. She actually had a breakdown. And so I never knew I had an uncle who was in the arts at all until she completely hit it. And because I never knew him, never met him until I was 19. I went to Vietnam for the first time. I was born in Vietnam, but I was like a year and a half when I left. So to me, going back when I was 19 was, for me, my first time. And then I meet this, this man who's my uncle, who's like this, amazing actor, and it kind of blew my mind. And I was like really angry and bitter with my mom that she's like tried to every way she could, try to persuade me not to go into the arts. And then I found out, I have this uncle, and I realized that, there's probably some sense of destiny, right? The more she pushed me away, the more I gravitated towards it, and then I ended up working with my uncle anyways.
So remember that, all of you who are majoring in physics or maths, that's probably what they wanted you to do, or be pre-med. There's still a career for you in film if you want.
Definitely
Just
do not
brave.
do that. Yeah.
Okay, Tonel.
Thank you so much, Professor. I just want to say it is such a privilege to see this film here with this audience. There's just something about the magic of cinema and seeing it with others. I feel really lucky to see it for the first time here. And also, speaking of the magic of cinema, even the technological difficulty at the beginning, I think really brought out what I think is one of the most special things about the film, which is the Vietnamese language and how it sounds. Those first few moments when we encounter the language and the beautiful imagery of your film without having the subtitle and the meaning to latch onto, I think really encourages an active imagination of what is happening and an acute attention to, you know, the details that you have so lovingly crafted your image. So my question has got to do with this notion of mystery, which, you know, is evoked in the beginning of the screening, but also throughout the film with the song that the girl from the Floating Market was singing. The sense of this mystery that is really, you cannot, there's no real answer to her questions, but to draw in that sense of mystery is beautiful and liberating. So what I'm getting at is, I'm wondering, I mean, when you first came to Vietnam when you were 19, what struck you? What mystery drew you in, and what were you curious about?
You know, it's a good question. You know, I have to admit that when I first went to Vietnam, I actually rejected it. I grew up in the Bay Area around Palo Alto, Sunnyvale. My parents worked in technology, and I fell in love with cinema. And but I went back, and I just didn't connect in the beginning with the country. I didn't, you know, I was just, you know, maybe I was ill prepared for it. Maybe in many ways I thought I would have a different experience, and you know, it was a difficult, that first few days and that first week when I went to Vietnam, it was actually, I had a difficult time connecting. And I remember very clearly asking my dad, who you know brought me, that if I said this very clear, if I had a button I can press, I would go right back to America. And but something happened, and it wasn't until I remember I was there for 2 weeks, and I remember being on the plane flying back to America, and I remember just being in tears. And I was like really confused by that because I actually did not like the first 2 weeks I was there. I didn't like the experience. And you know, there's a lot, you know, going on in my life at the time. And part of it is I felt like I was being forced to go back by my dad at the time. And so there was probably that tension as well. But I started crying, and it took me a while to figure out what was happening there and why I started crying. And so there were obviously connections that were happening on a subconscious level that I wasn't aware of, and it was a connection to family, it was a connection to the land, it was a connection to the sounds, it was a connection to the language, it was a connection, you know, even to the food, everything, you know. But you know, and some of it's obvious because you know you're in this new country, new space. But the part of for me that I think that was I could not identify at that moment until much later was the connection to, I think, being in a space in which all the words, you know, and the other thing is I forgot to say is I did not grow up in a Vietnamese community. I grew up in an area, now San Jose has this large, you know, Vietnamese community, but at that time I didn't live in San Jose, and so I wasn't around that you know, hearing all those words. This is why, you know, at the end of the day, we talk about representation. Representation actually matters. You know, whichever that representation is, it was actually an amazing feeling to be in a country and hearing all the sounds of a language that was only spoken at home. And I was actually a little bit embarrassed because, you know, if you grew up in America, I was like embarrassed the fact that I go home, all this Vietnamese was spoken, and then I go to the schools and it's all English, and there's this two worlds kind of pulling me, you know, between the, you know, it's just two different sides, and you know, there's, you know, if you're a Vietnamese American kid growing up during that time period, there was a little bit of shame as well. And, you know, you go home, you hear your parents speak with this accent, you know, you eat different kinds of food at home, you go to school and you eat different kinds of food. But being in that space was incredible, in which everyone spoke the same language. You know, the food, the language, the poetry, the sounds. I remember going to the bookstore in America. It would be hard to find one Asian face, you know, in the magazine rack or even in all the book rack, right? But in Vietnam, like every single face was Vietnamese. it's such a small thing that, but the impact of it, is, I mean, it's small in the sense that I was walking into just one little bookstore, but the impact of it was really huge. And that's when then I went back and I remember at 19, I already wanted to be a filmmaker, but it wasn't like I knew I was going to make films in Vietnam, So I came back, it changed the books I would read, it changed the movies I would watch, it changed, I had a different kind of purpose as a filmmaker. And I felt like if that was the impact I had by watching, seeing these faces in this bookstore, then what impact could I have by putting those faces on the big screen and showing it, in this sort of cinematic form, and to other people who like myself. And so that was, a lot of what I was emotionally going through at the time. And but the language was really important to me. I know sort of a long answer to this is because as a reaction to what I was saying earlier, in all those American war films, Vietnamese was actually not spoken because it was actually shot in Thailand or the Philippines. So it was always, they were using Thai actors or Filipino actors, and rarely was Vietnamese spoken. And there was the idea that, it was close enough and it didn't really matter. And, and a lot of times it was actually just gibberish. It wasn't even Vietnamese. And because they were focused on other characters and other storylines, and that's fine. But, as a Vietnamese person, I just knew that, when it was my time to make a film, I wanted to make sure the Vietnamese language, songs, poetry, all that would be, honored and in the forefront. And so that's why I chose to do that.
There's no shame, Tony. It's okay. And maybe John Phan, who was one of our co-organizers of 5030, can also say maybe his first return to Vietnam wasn't a smooth trip. Mine definitely was. And I think Vietnam, the first time I went was 94, and it was really difficult. I mean, it's not the country that we know it today. And there was still a lot of leftover tension between the Vietnamese who fled and the Vietnamese who stayed behind. So there was a bit of a discrimination. I would say that, especially this year, 50th anniversary, Vietnam and its current leadership has made, great strides to try to amend and to really promote reconciliation between Vietnamese. Other questions? Where are my students? I see one all the way in the back. I can't.
Hi, I'm Keitel. I'm a senior at Columbia. I'm in Professor Boy's Vietnam War cinema class, as well as Professor Hong's History of the Vietnam War course. My question is, the Vietnam War created a huge amount of divisions within American society that continue to persist today. And as was discussed in some of the panels over the last couple of days at the forum uptown, sometimes international reconciliation is easier than intranational reconciliation. How might art and cinema help drive the process of reconciliation between Americans on the question of the Vietnam War and similar issues? What themes would be especially powerful to focus on to achieve reconciliation? And are there any films from your selection for the Criterion Collection that you think do a good job of encapsulating said themes? Thank you.
I wasn't clear on the question. But.
Because this follows from an issue that we discussed on May 1st, that sometimes domestic reconciliation or reconciliation between the same communities more difficult to achieve than international, so state to state. And then which films that you chose for Criterion?
Yeah. So thanks, Michael, for the question. And so what he was referencing, for those who don't know, is the Criterion Collection, which is they've been involved in showing incredible domestic and global cinema for decades. And a lot of the great, auteur filmmakers have their film there, from Truffaut, Godard, Kurosawa, Scorsese, everyone. The Criterion Collection was way, when I was in film school, how we would watch these great cinemas of the world. And they had actually reached out to me to show 3 seasons, which is, just a huge honor to have my film on this collection. And but more discussions happened, and we actually talked about, the 50th anniversary coming. So they asked me then to curate a program in which would be modeled after the class I teach at Columbia, which is a class called Vietnam War Cinema, which I pair American war films with Vietnamese war films based on theme. So each week would be a different theme, and I show the American perspective of that and the Vietnamese perspective of that through cinema. And they thought that was such a great idea. So I ended up curating this program, and which is on the Criterion Channel now. It was launched a couple weeks ago. and to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And I'm really proud of it because I was able to show different perspectives from an American cinema, but also show a few Vietnamese films that have actually never been shown in the West. And I even go back to my first film on this list is from 1959, and it's a film that speaks to the sort of the early days of Vietnamese Revolution that deals with sort of the French and the splitting of the DMZ line in 1954. I think. So I'm really proud of it, and you guys have a chance to check out the collection. But I think, I think cinema has a place, and storytelling has a place. And that place is, I think we can reach people in a way that let's say the news cycles or books or textbooks or history classes, all incredibly important and vital. But I think stories, we try to do something else. We can penetrate differently. And we are able to take some of these complex ideas and create an emotional connection out of it. And at the end of the day, it's incredibly important. I think I said this in a talk on Friday, that, a lot of times when you hear a song and you remember that song 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, it's not because just the song itself, but because of the emotions that it creates, right? So that emotions, create this memory in you. And cinema and storytelling does the same thing. And cinema is a way of dramatizing, complex ideas, complex thoughts, and creates this emotion. That emotion then stays within you as this memory that goes on. And what that does is it actually helps you connect with a certain time period, connect with a certain theme, connect with a certain thought in a way that makes for the conversation to be more rich and deeper. And I think that's the power of literature, the power of poetry, the power of cinema. And so I think a lot of times, when I know that a lot of my understanding of countries that we are often thought about as enemies, or as, by watching the films of those countries, I have a complete understanding of those countries and those people, right? Films from Iran, like amazing films, like Kiarostami, or films from Russia, like, early Tarkovsky movies. And so I think cinema has a way of bridging those divides in a way that I think is very difficult in other disciplines. Anyways.
The grazie out there. History books can do the same thing, right, Vicky? It's an ongoing debate that I have with Tony Boy. More questions. I think I saw one from Norman. Wait, Norman, I think there'll be a microphone.
Excuse me, it's very exciting to hear about this Criterion collection, but why did it take so long?
Why did it take so long?
So long for Americans to do that. We have an expert in the Cold War, I guess that's a part of it, but why is it that my generation our images of that war come right out of those American Vietnam War films, and these films have been around for decades. And if you do that, I did some scholarship a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and nobody's written, or few people have written about it, few people have seen them, and I think that's a disgrace in terms of American academics. The scholars, not the film scholars, but the history professors should have brought attention to that. Now most of them are dead or dying out. We don't get to see that, and they're amazing.
I think the question is, why did it take so long for the Criterion Collection to allow for a list to have included both American and Vietnamese films?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. I think it took this 50th anniversary, meeting the moment for them to do it. I think it comes down to, I don't know. I think. I wish it would have been done sooner, for sure. I'm glad it's being done now. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that because I don't know what the, I don't know why. Yeah.
So I see a cluster of 3 questions there. If we could just get each of them to ask, and then we'll close it there, and you can choose. Okay, so.
All right, I'll be quick. But good evening, everyone. I'm in Professor Lien-Hang's class as well. And I did have a question, Professor Roy, concerning, I know that you were talking about the aftermath, and I was really intrigued by that. So here's my question. So how do you think we can sort of change the culture in the cinema industry to expand on the definition of war to include the aftermath? And do you see your film being, I guess, as an ambassador to changing that culture in the cinema industry, whether it be in Hollywood or independent film?
I'm sorry.
So just if I get that right, the question is, how do we grapple with the end of the war, legacies of war, as films made that address that to be part of the war film canon? Wait, they're going to ask, I think. So just go ahead and ask the questions that remain, because we only have about 4 minutes and we probably have to end. So I just want to make sure whoever has a question, ask.
Hi, my name is Artemis. I'm also a student of Professor Hong and Professor Bui. And my question is, well, your film makes the rather rare decision to show different storylines that don't explicitly interweave or have that moment at the end where all the characters meet and have that catharsis to tie all the storylines together. It's much more subtle. And I want to know, how did you make the choice to show 3 separate, distinct storylines, and what meaning does that imbue for the story you wanted to tell about Vietnam?
Hello, is this right? Is on? I'm not a student, sorry. Something that stood out to me was the score. I thought it felt very European and Western in its score. And there was some like Vietnamese sprinkled on top. I was curious if that was like a conscious decision. Maybe you wanted like a European presence to always be there, but not actively like as a role in the film. So I was curious about how you came about making the score, working with Mr. Horowitz on that.
I'm not a student either. I'm just very curious, have you noticed that there are aspects of the film that resonated more with Vietnamese audience versus American audience?
Okay, great. Okay, so first, legacies of war. How does that get incorporated into the war canon? Why 3 stories, 3 vignettes? How did you make them into one? The score, very European. Could you address that, the music? And the last question, how did the Vietnamese audience receive the film?
Okay, so I'll just try to go backwards. So the film was actually the official selection of Vietnam to the Oscars. And so so to do that, you have to screen in Vietnam, and then Vietnam, so actually all the countries, every country gets to pick one film submitted to the Oscars as part of their process. So Vietnam selected 3 seasons as its official entry. I was extremely honored and proud of that. And the film was shortlisted. It ended up not getting nominated, but it's shortlisted. And you know it's shortlisted because you actually are told, and then you get invited. You have to go through this whole process at the Academy. That was Don, who actually had to leave. Don actually is the head of the Academy. Actually, they run the Oscars, but that was before her time. But so you get you get invited to these. Basically, you get talked through what will happen if you get nominated. You have to know all these different steps and stuff like that. It's all behind the scenes stuff. So I was really proud of that Vietnam chose it. But in terms of it's still an art house films and art house independent films. It's hard to find an audience in America, and it's hard to find an audience in Vietnam. But people know about the film, people see it, so I'm really proud of it. I don't remember all the other questions, but
Music, the score, European.
Oh, so we use different composers. We use Vietnamese composer with European composers, and we combined those 2 together. So it was the tradition of Vietnamese scoring for cinema at that time in the 90s there wasn't a deep tradition of that. But we wanted to make sure we had authentic Vietnamese music in there, and instruments and singing and but then we also used a composer from the West to tie a lot of that stuff together, and because they understood film composition and how to make sure the film composition was also its own language as well. So we had obviously the visual language and we had the audio language as well, and to make sure the music represented. We basically did different themes for different characters, And so it's very subtle, but like, you know, Woody had his own theme, and the Lotus Picker had her own theme, Kinan, and the, you know, Sickle Driver had their own themes. And visually as well, there's different color palettes, different music. So that kind of nuance really requires someone who did a lot of film composition music. So, but then we use a lot of the instruments and worked with a lot of Vietnamese musicians as well. So it's really important. And then
I think the two, you're going to be able to continue that conversation with them because we're right at the 7 p.m. mark. So we'll save those two for a next occasion. But thank you all for coming here tonight. Please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Tony Boyd.